Hello, everybody. Welcome to session 3 of this Power Platform Architecture series on Power Virtual Agents. In this session, we're going to be talking about extending out your PVA bot with Power Platform. This is session 3 of this series, so if this is the first one you've reached, you're welcome to stay with us for this one, but also reach back and look at the other sessions to get a bit of context on what we're doing. So just a bit about this series. If you're new to this is a series really designed for architects, developers, IT pros. If you're embarking on a project to implement Power Virtual Agents and kind of want a tour of the features, how it's used, and some of the things you need to be aware of in building out a solution with Power Virtual Agents, this is the place to be. As I said before, this is in separate sessions, and we're building up a complete architecture as we go. And we also have a pack of example materials, including the slide deck we're going to be going through today, that we'll link to in the notes and on the screen here, that will allow you to follow along and build out your own first bot. But on to this session. So Ken.
All right, so about this session, so let's talk about chatbot extensibility. And we're going to start off with Power Automate, and then later on in this series, we're going to talk about some other approaches as well. And so naturally, when we think about extensibility, it allows you or organizations to be able to tap into other systems in order to derive additional value. And what we've seen is that like frequently asked questions or Q&A bots are useful. There's no question. They allow for some deflection. But when you're able to go ahead and transact on behalf of that user, that is going to even drive more value, especially if it removes manual work and drives other automation opportunities. And it's one of those things where, like, even I was thinking about this morning in bed. I don't know why, but it was kind of like, if we think back to like even early websites, right? There was this transition between I'm just going to provide content over a website, and then I'm going to then allow you to go ahead and act on it. So even think about, we're totally dating ourselves, but back in the day, you'd be able to maybe look up, say, like an air flight schedule, and it would say, oh, it leaves this time and arrives this time, and this is the airport. And then all of a sudden you could go ahead and book the ticket yourself and transact, through e-commerce. And chatbots are kind of like that, where you can go ahead and provide frequently asked questions, great. But when you can actually go ahead and transact on behalf of the user, you're going to be able to get even more value out of it. And when we do talk about extensibility, we do have a few options. There's a spectrum here, and really that spectrum starts with no code, and Power Automate would fit into that category. And then it progresses into pro code solutions itself. And so this is that spectrum that I was referring to. And naturally with Power Automate, there is the no code where you can, truly just deploy a template and use it and type in, your credentials. And then you can start to get into like including custom connectors and the on-premise data gateway and some of these more advanced concepts. And then you get into Bot Framework Composer, which is still a low code option, but definitely requiring some additional technical capabilities than perhaps just a no code approach. And then we get into a full code or a pro code approach where we're writing in our favorite framework, such as like C# or JavaScript, and we're able to go ahead and embed that in a bot framework skill itself. So for the
sorry, Ken, I was just going to call that. We will cover these. We're not going to cover everything in this session, but we will be covering those two things in session 4, the next session. But I think it's important to call out here how the slide you've got here has these things connected together, because it's quite often, you talk with the customer and developers, and they assume that these things are completely separate, and they're not. It's a continuum, right?
Absolutely, right. And there's also no right or wrong answer here. I think a lot of this is very much dependent upon your organization and how you are skilled up and your capabilities. But I would always look at, writing less code than writing more code, right? You're going to be able to solve those problems much faster. Okay, so now here we've got our famous slide, our architecture slide from the series itself. And so what we're going to focus on here is this right-hand corner, right? So we're going to focus on our Power Automate and the ability to leverage connectors. These are Power Platform connectors that allow us to connect to other services such as Software as a service could be like ServiceNow, for example. We're going to talk a little bit more about Q&A Maker in this upcoming session itself, but that's another back-end system that we can go ahead and call from Power Automate. We also have AI Builder, which exposes artificial intelligence capabilities through the use of a connector. And then we also have RPA, Power Automate Desktop, and those capabilities. And just for a reference, right, we can also see up in the left-hand corner, we do have Bot Framework, the service, right, the Azure Bot Service, where we can build skills and plug them into PVA. And then we also have the recently introduced Bot Framework Composer integration. And as Matt mentioned, we'll talk about those in an upcoming session itself. Okay, so what is Power Automate? So Power Automate's a no-code SaaS tool that enables automation. And what it is very good at doing is providing people with the ability to orchestrate API calls across various systems. So you can really think of it much like a workflow, and the ability to take data from point A and point B, enrich it, call point C, provide some logic and transformation to address a specific use case itself. Now, as part of your Power Virtual Agents license or your entitlement, you do get access to Power Automate, including premium connectors and higher API thresholds. So this becomes very advantageous for you, knowing that you're getting this additional value as part of your existing license. Now, one of Power Automate's strengths is its 400 plus connectors that are available to be used within the tool. And what this does is this naturally extends our reach from a chatbot perspective, where we can tap into all of these different data sources in order to enrich the experience of our chatbot users itself. Now, you might be asking, well, what happens if you don't have the connector I'm looking for, or maybe I need to call on premises to reach into an existing system I have? How are you going to help me solve that problem? The good news is, because we have the on-premise data gateway that's part of the Power Platform, we can tap into that from a Power Automate perspective and really unlock those local data sources as well. Now, one thing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in our tips, is that we do need to be careful. Power Automate does have this request response nature, and as a result, it's very important that when we design our interfaces, that we avoid blocking customer requests. The last thing we want to do is have a user or a chatbot customer that is waiting for something to happen and they get a timeout, and they're quite likely at that point to go ahead and click the X button and move on, because they're going to feel like it's a broken experience itself.
And I'm just going to call out the point 3 there again, because it's a super common thing that people miss, and we even highlighted it in the previous session, but Power Automate is included in your PVA license. It's not an additional thing you factor in, it's included and it's there to be used.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is the Power Automate experience, or a screenshot of that, where we can go ahead from a Power Virtual Agent topics, go ahead and add an action. And when we add an action, we have the ability to go ahead and to call it existing flow that is within our environment and that is in a solution that we have access to, or we can go ahead and to create a flow directly from here. Now, what you'll notice is that when we go ahead and call a flow, we do have inputs and outputs. So we can pass data from PVA, Power Virtual Agents, into Power Automate, do some work, do some data wrangling, call downstream systems, and then return a result. And by defining these inputs and outputs as part of our Power Automate flow, we will then have typed messages and contracts inside of Power Virtual Agents that allows us to select variables from our PVA topic and then pass those details in. And then naturally we can use those responses as part of messages that we send back to the users themselves. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a scenario. Let's try to make this real. And so what we've got here, naturally we've got our architecture diagram, we've got our connectors, and we've got ServiceNow, a popular SaaS-based application. So we get asked this question a lot, and hence we're including it here. So you might have ServiceNow, you use it to help manage your service desk, and it unlocks the ability for people to request actions or request knowledge about, say, specific computing devices or other organizational requests that you store and manage inside of ServiceNow. But what if we wanted to expose some of that functionality through a chatbot. So instead of me having to say email the service desk or calling the service desk, what if I could go ahead and use a chatbot that would allow me to go ahead and interact with your source of truth, which in this case would be ServiceNow. And we can do that quite easily through the use of these connectors that allow us to go ahead and log incidents, retrieve incidents, update incidents, etc. And so this allows us to provide many opportunities for our chatbot and basically giving better service to our end users without having to add, say, more staff to basically handle an increased call volume. So we can support those how do I do those types of questions by using, say, the suggested topics feature, where we can have questions and answers and be able to deflect as much as possible from our staff itself. Now, we could also go even further to say, like, if I have a question about my Wi-Fi, why doesn't it work? We may be able to go ahead and check to see if there's any outages that have been reported and say, oh yeah, this is a known issue. It should be up, shortly. Or it could be even walking them through some self-service triage steps that may help them get unblocked and be able to solve their own problem without having to rely on other humans to get in the mix to help scale those efforts. And then we can even go as far as I mentioned before, logging a ticket request, being able to request the status update for the ticket, and being able to do that in a self-service interface without needing to bother other people, but be able to get that information quite quickly. And so this is just a scenario of how we could use Power Automate in the enterprise in order to unlock some of those help desk or service desk scenarios itself.
I think this one's a really great one because it's quite a. I mean, if you had to build this from scratch, right, it'd be pretty complicated. There's a whole bunch of different pieces you need to build here, but you could take something like this and demo it to others as the power of connecting these things together. And it'll probably take you an hour or two to put all the pieces together, if not less.
Well, and yeah, this was a real test for me. Like when I went and joined the team, about a year ago, I went and built out this scenario myself just to see how long it would take, because my prior experience was building this exact scenario, but using other tools. And I remember spending, at least 40 hours building out this basically experience, writing code that would represent my topics or my dialogues, and then having to publish a whole bunch of components in the public cloud in order to get this working. And then I went back and did it here, and it was, within 2 hours, I had something working. And for me, it was like, okay, this is mind-blowing, because this is game changer, because I'm able to accomplish the same thing that took me 40 hours in about 2. And the other nice thing is that, once I have this built, I can choose where I want to publish it. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't have had that same ability. That would have taken me even more time to do that, if I would have used that other approach as opposed to this approach where it's like, oh, publish to Teams. And now this just lights up in Teams and I can share it and people can use it as well.
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about tips here. I've got 5 for you, and we've got some demos to help support the content as well. So Power Automate works in both a synchronous and asynchronous manner. And so what this means is when we're in, say, a chatbot scenario, we're going to use a synchronous process where I make a request, Power Automate does a bunch of stuff, and it sends basically a response back. And that's request response. That's our synchronous approach. It also can address use cases through asynchronous processing. Perhaps I'm going to go ahead and retrieve an email, and I'm going to be looking at an inbox and retrieving any emails that have a specific subject. I can go ahead and retrieve that, do a whole bunch of things, and then go ahead and send out a response, later on through another channel, even to that user that made that request. And it's one of those things where, I don't have to have this match between request and response. So because of the nature of Power Automate and its ability to support both of those interaction types, there are some behaviors that we need to be familiar with in order to better address chatbot scenarios. And that's really the core of some of these tips. We don't want to have a bad experience for our end users because we're using Power Automate in perhaps an asynchronous manner when we need to optimize for those synchronous interactions itself. And the big thing that we, much like a slow web page that loads, no one wants to hang around for that experience. We need to think about chatbots in the same manner, where we need to think about how do we get a response back to the user as fast as possible. So the first tip we're going to talk about is avoid looping. So this is one of those, I would call it bittersweet features of Power Automate. Power Automate makes it extremely easy to iterate over a collection. A collection, it could be an array, it could be in a list. But this whole idea is I might have a record set and I need to go through each of those records one by one in doing something. And Power Automate will automatically include an apply to each that allows you to go ahead and do so. However, back to the core, concerns about synchronous processing, this is going to only add time to our basically our process, and we want to find ways to reduce it. Now, the ways that we can reduce it, one is using, say, OData filters when a connector supports it, or even using expressions. So there's an expression called first that allows us to go ahead and pluck off the first record of a result set. Now, naturally, that can't just be any first record, but instead of having an apply to each that's just going to go ahead and loop, if we know that we're only getting one record returned from our result set, but the shape is still an array, we can use this first expression to go ahead and to retrieve that. So let's go ahead and jump into a demo here, and just to help illustrate this. So what I've got here is tip number 1, and it is called avoiding loops. And what we're going to go ahead and do is just go ahead and call a flow, and then we're going to get the response back from that flow. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at our Power Automate Cloud flow, this is what it's going to look like. And this is just, as an example to highlight sort of the opportunities of using this approach. So what we're going to do is we're first going to go ahead and declare a variable that's going to be of type string. And this is just going to hold our account name. We're then going to go ahead and use a try scope. That's going to allow us to go ahead and do some work. And then we're going to go ahead and catch any exceptions. We will have a tip on exception handling. We'll explain that in more details. But so this is the default behavior, right? When you go ahead and want to look up accounts from, say, the Microsoft Dataverse, this is the default experience where I'm going to go ahead and retrieve accounts, and I need to provide like a top count. Otherwise, I'm going to get a warning in my flow checker, and it's going to go ahead and retrieve up to 100 records from this accounts table itself. Then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each of these records that are returned, and then go ahead and do a check to say, is my account name equal to Contoso? If so, we're just going to go ahead and store this account ID in the variable. So this isn't an optimized path for processing those records. There's a few things that we can do to speed this up. And so the one thing that we're going to do initially is we're going to use OData. So if we know that we're looking for essentially an account name called Contoso, we can go ahead and include that filter query up front. And so that this will basically automatically filter out at source any records that aren't related to Contoso. So that's number 1. Now, number 2 is even if I would have gone ahead and tried to use the output, in this case, the account ID that I had here, and I went and tried to go ahead and add that to my compose action here, it would automatically go ahead and, introduce an apply to each, which means we're now going to have an extra loop. But instead of doing that, what I can go ahead and do is use this first expression. And using this first expression allows me to go ahead and retrieve the first account ID from our result set. And that will allow us to avoid having an apply to each loop, which doesn't add a whole lot of value here because we know we're only going to get one record. We'll then go ahead and just return this value back to our chatbot. So let's go ahead and we're just going to kick off this topic by typing in loop. And it's going to then go out, contact our flow, and then basically provide a response back to us. Right, so we have the account ID that was just sent. So let's just go ahead and take a look here at our run history. And now as part of our run history, what we're doing here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to list our records. We're going to have this apply to each. We're going to go through every 9 records, and we're then going to go ahead and evaluate and find out if any of them are related to Contoso. Now, imagine that's 9 records. Imagine if it was 100 records, right? That's only going to get worse. As opposed to being able to go ahead and just go after the account that we're interested in, and we'll only pull back a single account, and we won't have to do any additional looping. And then what we can go ahead and do is go ahead and retrieve the value. So the outcomes are the same in terms of how we set the account ID, but the method is different in terms of how we go ahead and accomplish that. And so that's essentially tip number one on how you can avoid looping, and you should avoid looping wherever possible. Sometimes it may not be practical, but where possible, you should definitely try to avoid looping because you're only going to add to the amount of time it takes to return a result back to the chatbot.
And this is super, super common that we see people making this mistake, right? It's the number one thing that people do that they miss, and then they have performance issues and things like that. And I suppose with a bot in front of it, it's even more important to be aware of that problem.
And I would also add to it is the use of variables inside a loop is also a very expensive operation as well. And so that would be another thing, is where you can use these expressions as opposed to setting variables will also pay benefits, especially with larger data sets itself. Okay, so the next one, and this one may not be overly intuitive, but it's actually it's very important. So the tip is called don't unnecessarily block callers. So when possible, return control back to PVA and then process additional flow actions after the return value action. And so this is another one that does require some consideration. It has to make sense from a business process perspective. So for example, if you need to return an ID back or like a ticket number, something like that, to your bot user, this approach may not work for you. But where you have a scenario where you can basically follow up asynchronously, then you can go ahead and use this pattern. So let's just go ahead, let's head back to our maker portals and let's explore this use case. Okay, so we've got tip 2, avoid blocking calls. And so once again, we're going to go ahead, we're going to call a flow, we're going to get the status back. And if we go ahead and look at this specific flow, what we're going to have is a trigger as normal to kick off our process. Then what we're going to do is return a response. And so this is essentially an acknowledgement. It could be, in this case, I'm using success, but it could be, working on your request, something so that the user knows that hey, you're working on my problem. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and send an email. And this is arbitrary what we're doing here, but it just gives you this perspective that we've already returned control back to the chatbot. Then we're going to go ahead and do a bunch of work downstream. Now, the challenge with this approach is that you can't communicate back to that chatbot user, so you do need to use some sort of asynchronous approach in order to contact them. So if you have an email address, great. You can also use an adaptive card if it's an internal audience, where you could go ahead and once you've done some processing, go ahead and use an adaptive card to say, hey, I'm done your work, everything's good. Or, hey, I ran into an error, you need to look into this. But those are other options that we have the ability to plug into. So just to make this real, let's go ahead and run this, and then we'll take a look at the run history, and you'll see that we returned control back to our caller, and then we did some downstream processing. So let's just go ahead and type in block. And what we'll see here is basically an immediate response of success. If we head back over to Power Automate, let's look at our run history. What we'll see is that we've gone ahead and we've returned control back to the chatbot. And then what we've done is we've done this work after the fact. In this case, it was 2 seconds after the fact. But what if it would have been 2 minutes, right? That makes a big difference. Our chatbot would time out in that 2 minute time frame itself. And so this is where some people, especially if you've done a lot of programming and you're used to like a synchronous method call or function call, it's kind of like, hey, I can't do this. I can't do this work after I've returned control back. But because Power Automate is essentially orchestrating that for us, its engine is able to support that. So it's almost more like asynchronous programming, but using a synchronous request response pattern here. So it's a bit of a hybrid from that perspective. Okay, so let's jump to the next one. And this one is pretty important. It's something you hopefully are already doing, but technically it is possible to go ahead and to create a flow from outside of the PVA portal and then being able to call it, especially if it's part of a solution and you have access to it within the environment. So what the guidance here is, always create a flow from inside of Power Virtual Agents. And the reason for this is, and this is a part of our documentation, which is called out here, is that we do stamp these templates essentially. And so it gets stamped to know that this is coming from a PVA entitlement. And as a result, you get additional API calls than you would if, say, you were using your Office 365 entitlement. And so that makes a big difference. The other thing is that you naturally get your premium connectors as part of this. Now, if you don't go ahead and provision this flow from using this template, you won't have the stamp. And then as a result, you could run into challenges with the API limits because you won't be using the correct stamped template itself. And so certainly some folks that started to build flows before we introduced the PVA trigger, you would have been using HTTP. This is definitely something to take a look at, but going forward, you absolutely want to be provisioning from here.
I think a way to think about them there is almost an extension of PVA, right? That's the way you should think about building them out.
Yeah, like that's the way I look at it anyways. Like I'm going to be in the Maker portal itself, and then like while I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and click on call in action and then, use this. Another good practice is always rename this. As soon as you create it, it's going to come up with like this Power Virtual Agents template, some sort of name. Go ahead and rename it. It should be the first thing you do. Otherwise, in your list, you're going to see a whole bunch of flows that are going to be all named the same, and you're not going to easily know which one is which unless you click into them, which isn't great.
And the rename is not always obvious, but it's up there on the left-hand side of the screen, right? But yeah, I have fallen foul to this, having 14 flows that all have basically the same name due to my own incompetence.
So the next tip we want to talk about is called fail fast. And what this means is we want to, if we know we have an exception, and that exception is only going to reoccur if we try that operation again, why are we frustrating our user more than we need to? It's one of those things where if you're going to get a failure, it's probably better to get that failure in 5 seconds than it is, say, within a minute. And so what happens when we do have Power Automate is that we do have a default retry policy that does exist. And what we can see is that it will run through an exponential interval policy, and will retry 4 times. Now, this is generally give or take within a minute that is going to occur. And in the meantime, that could result in your flow timing out. Or even worse, you're going to throw back an unhandled exception back to the client, and they're going to get a really ugly error message. And so from my perspective, I would much rather go ahead, and if I can't call a downstream API, I would rather know right away that it's failed, capture that alert or that error, and then provide a meaningful and more user-friendly error message back to the caller, and not make them wait, because that's only going to frustrate them more so. So let's go ahead once again, let's get back into a demo and take a look at this. Okay, so we've got tip 4 and we've got retry settings. And let's go ahead, let's take a look at the flow first, just to give some context, because this one's a little weird in order to get this to happen. So what we're going to do here is we're going to just pass in a request. In this case, it's a URL. We're going to go ahead and we have a status variable here where we can store the status. Was this successful or was this failure? I've got a value here which includes an API key. I'm then going to go ahead and call an API that's hosted in Azure API Management. Now, within Azure API Management, they do have what's known as basically throttling, request throttling, where if you make too many requests in a short period of time, you can actually get throttled. And as a result, basically you're going to get essentially an error that says, hey, you've got a problem. So I'm using Azure API Management just to help demonstrate, how I can have a service that sometimes it's going to be successful, but if I call it too frequently, it's going to fail. And so instead of going through retries, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and return that error right away. And so when we click on settings and we scroll down to retry policy, I've flipped it from default to none. So this won't retry. And what we'll do is if we run into an exception, we can go ahead and update our variable to indicate that an error has occurred and please try again. And then what happens if we've got a successful call, we're going to go ahead and provide that status call. And then we'll go ahead and return that variable back out to the chatbot itself. So what we're going to do is I'm going to copy my endpoint here, and we're going to head into this specific topic. And what we'll just say retry. And then I'm going to get prompted for a URL. And so I'm going to provide the URL, and the first time this runs, life will be good. And it's going to return a success, and that's exactly the outcome that we're looking for. But let's go ahead, let's run this again. It will provide the URL. And see, we've now been able to provide a handled exception back to the user. Now, let's pretend here that this API management cache refresh didn't refresh within essentially a minute. Let's say that this was a system down. There was a downstream system. What would have happened there was I would have continued to retry 4 times and then spit out this error, as opposed to, hey, I know it's down. I'm going to just return an error immediately, and to be able to draft basically my own more user-friendly error message than the system default itself. Okay, so the next one is exception handling. And so this is where we're going to be able to tap into an existing capability found in Power Automate called scopes. And what we're going to do is we can use these scopes to model try-catch semantics. So if you've ever written C# or Java code, you've chances are written your try-catch. We're going to use this in a very similar manner. And the whole idea here is we don't want to return an unhandled exception back to our user, because it's going to be very technical and you're going to get this ugly conversation ID, and it's not going to be a great experience. So instead, if I can basically tailor a more user-friendly experience and I can provide a handled exception, that's naturally a better strategy for us to take. So let's go ahead, let's jump over to that topic. And then what we'll do is here we're going to do everyone's favorite math problem, like divide by 0, but we're going to be able to use that in order to catch our exception itself. So here's the flow that we do have. We're going to store a float variable called result. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a couple parameters, right? So we've got num1 and num2. And then we're going to go ahead and perform our calculation, just a division problem here, and set the value to our result variable, which is basically of type float. And we're going to do this inside of our try scope. Now, to create a scope itself, all we have to do is add an action, type in scope, and then be able to go ahead and just drop it on our canvas, and then go ahead and rename it. Now, the secondary one that we have here is I went ahead and added a second scope, and then what I can do is I can configure it so that it will only run if this scope fails. But otherwise, what it will do is we'll just go ahead and return the value to this last return value action itself. Now, in order to configure this, I go ahead and I click on the ellipsis, and then I click on configure run after, and by default, every action is going to be set to is successful. But that's not what we want here. So what we do is we click on has failed, is skipped, and has timed out. And only under those circumstances will we go ahead and basically call this specific action itself. And here's where we can provide that user-friendly error message. And then what we're doing is sending the same variable back out to PVA, regardless if it was successful or if it failed itself. So let's go ahead and let's now call this. And we'll go ahead and say errors. And then we'll just provide num1, then number2, and then we expect to get a proper result. Life's good. So let's go ahead, let's run this again. And we will do 10, and then we'll provide 0, And then this should go ahead and call our error handler and then be able to provide a user-friendly message back out to the chatbot. So let's just go ahead and take a look at that run history. Oops. And so what we can see here is that we tried to perform our calculation. As a result, it failed, which essentially bubbles up to our scope, and then we see our scope has a failed status, which then allows our catch scope to go ahead and be called, and then we'll go ahead and provide our basically our error message. Now, if we go ahead and look at the first request, what we can see here is that we're going to perform our calculation and that we have a proper result. We update our variable and include like basically the outcome of our calculation. And then notice how we skipped the catch here, and we'll just go ahead and return those values back out through the return values to PVA action itself. So yeah, those are the 5 tips that you should always be considering whenever building cloud flows as part of your chatbot solution itself.
I think with those, Ken, I mean, people may say, well, why those 5? But if you follow those 5 tips, they're really common things that we see people raising support requests for, and giving feedback that the platform doesn't do what they want. If they follow those tips, it allows them to build some really quite reliable enterprise integration. So they're so important to follow, and they may I suppose some of them may have more of a pro dev slant to them, but I think when we're talking about building chatbots, and particularly if you're going to go and build a public facing one, right, it's so important to follow those things to make sure you build out a good quality experience for your customers.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's certainly the list doesn't end at 5, but no. It's one of those things where these are like you mentioned, the more popular, use cases that we run into and wanted to share those. But hey, if people have any tips that they use themselves, go ahead and add them in the comments. We'd love to hear what are some of your Power Automate tips when including in PVA itself.
Good stuff.
Cool. So let's switch gears a little bit here to AI Builder. And so we can leverage AI Builder as part of our extensibility story. Now, naturally, our natural language understanding engine itself, is a form of AI. And so that's something that's deeply embedded in the product itself. But we can use AI Builder to unlock additional AI use cases as well. And much like the Power Platform democratizes app building and report building and automation, AI Builder does the same thing from an artificial intelligence perspective itself. And then how do we go ahead and call this AI capabilities? We do so through the connectors found in Power Automate itself. Now, there are many different models that you can go ahead and use as part of your overall solution. Some are going to be better suited for chatbots and others may not. Now, a couple that do work out well, one would certainly be like language detection. That would work. Sentiment analysis could be another one that works well. The ability to go ahead and extract entities could work. And then also predictions. So, binary predictions is another use case as well. Some of the forms processing ones, those are going to be a little bit more difficult just because you need to be able to upload a PDF or binary data into the service. So I wouldn't start there. That requires some customization, generally through Bot Framework itself in order to be able to do that upload. But these other use cases would be applicable in our chatbot solutions itself. And naturally with AI Builder, there is an experience. You can find it inside of Power Automate or even Power Apps. These are typically generated through like learn by examples. So you provide examples, you go ahead and provide some level of training, and then you would have the ability to go ahead and call that. And so when you have like a runtime message, you can go ahead and pass it through the connector, choose your data model, and then it'll basically give you the outcome or the output that you can then use downstream as part of the experience itself. I know one demo that I've built in the past with a colleague is that we've gone ahead and tried to determine shipping patterns, right? So we used basically the predict and the binary classification model, and we wanted to be able to predict based upon previous goods that had been purchased and their shipping timelines, what would be the likelihood that we could go ahead and ship a new request, based upon a certain threshold itself. And so we could take our historical data, train it, then expose it, and then use that to predict whether or not a future shipping situation would align to those timelines or not. And so that's just to give you an example of how you could potentially use AI Builder with PVA.
I think the thing to just call out about that is it's a suite of possibilities, right? And it's people discount it, but quite often there's interesting possibilities that you can create with this, and it's worth applying to your business scenario and seeing if there's something here that you could model.
No, that's a good point. I think that's where, people always want to say, like, with all this technology becoming democratized, like, how do organizations compete with each other? And I think you just alluded to it, like, that becomes your secret sauce.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the innovation that you can take that actually separates your organization from a competitor by being able to tap into assets. In this case, the asset would be data, right? And then being able to use that to better predict outcomes going forward. So that's a great example. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Q&A Maker. And so Q&A Maker is part of the Azure Cognitive Services capabilities, and it does allow you to go ahead and leverage knowledge bases or product manuals in order to provide some level of self-service capabilities. It is exposed through Power Automate using a connector, which naturally makes it pluggable into a lot of the use cases that we've talked about here. I remember a couple of years ago building out some demos with John Levesque where we were trying to automate essentially Q&A based upon requests that would come into the flow team. And we would go ahead and use Q&A Maker to see if we had an existing answer, and then we would be able to post it to Yammer. And so, it is a neat service that does help you do some of those things. And naturally, there's going to be some overlap with PVA and the suggested topics capability itself. Now, what we typically do find, though, is that PVA is going to give you a richer experience in terms of multi-turn experiences. So we'll call a single turn when you basically provide an utterance or a request and you get a response. But whenever you've got these cycles where you need to collect more information and basically ask another question, and maybe you need to collect a bunch of information before you can go call the downstream system, naturally these are going to be in Power Virtual Agent sweet spot. Now, the other thing that can happen is you might have an existing Q&A Maker solution. You've made the investments, it's working for you, and you want to be able to leverage those existing investments. And one popular way that we do see this happening is through the PVA fallback topic. And so what that means is that when you enable a fallback topic, its whole purpose is to be able to be called when the chatbot isn't able to find a relevant topic to service the request of the end user. And so what we've seen some organizations leverage is basically when the fallback topic is actually called, then create a flow that will use the Power Automate Q&A Maker connector in order to see if it exists in that repository of information. And if it does and there's a match, you can go ahead and return it back to the caller, to the chatbot user itself. But it does give you another extensibility opportunity from that perspective.
I think thing to call out, obviously, is if people are coming at this new, Q&A Maker does have an additional cost, but it may be that the shape of their knowledge base or something like that aligns more with that than PVA initially. But you can certainly have, PVA doing some of your process automation and maybe your, most common multi-turn content, and then falling back to Q&A Maker for your huge knowledge base or something like that. That is a common pattern that customers implement.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, the next extensibility capability we want to talk about is Power Automate Desktop, otherwise known as PAD. And so what this is Microsoft's entrance into RPA, robotic process automation, and it is part of the Power Automate service itself. Now, what this allows you to do is from a Cloudflow, go ahead and call a desktop automation. And that desktop automation is going to go ahead and basically mimic the behaviors or the activities that a user would typically perform in a series of applications. So these are typically applications that don't have connectors, because otherwise we would just use the Cloudflow itself. But a common pattern is that we can actually take a manual business process through a combination of PVA, Power Automate, and Power Automate Desktop and automate it through a bot itself. Now, one thing I do want to call out back, and this goes back to a few slides ago, is that Power Automate typically operates in a request response interaction mode. And RPA processes can be long running. So you do want to be careful not to block your user and generate timeouts. Much like I just cautioned you a couple slides ago. And so we can use Power Automate and adaptive cards to asynchronously send them messages though. And so this could be a way where we still have a valid use case, but we're not blocking. And I believe we've got a little bit of an example here, right? So typically you might have a customer that goes ahead, fills out some sort of a form, and they might email it in, they might mail it in, whatever makes most sense. They could scan it, they could, snail mail it, whatever makes sense. Then you have someone that basically receives that form and then needs to basically type that information into a desktop application where it gets persisted, say, in a database. Now, an alternative approach could be, hey, as a customer, you're now going to go ahead and interact with a chatbot through Power Virtual Agents. As part of that, we will wire up basically a Cloudflow that will take in information that you would typically capture in this form. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and automate the input of that information into this same desktop application itself. And then the record will get basically launched into the database itself. And the only area where you do want to be careful with is you don't want necessarily this customer to be blocked while all of this is happening downstream. It might be one of those things of, thank you for submitting this request. Here is your ticket number. And then basically we will send you an update, once your application or your form has been processed. Then what you can go ahead and do is, do this work downstream without worrying about any sort of, blockings happening upstream, and then go ahead and send out a message asynchronous saying, yeah, we've processed your form, life's good, you're golden, and go about your day. So it is a popular use case. There are some things we can do, like I said, with the adaptive card. There's also some exciting things happening in the next little while here, which I can't talk about just yet, but when you do this through Teams, there's going to be some very great tools that are available to us that can, really enable some of these RPA processes as well.
I think just this one, Ken, it's a really good example of the "but what if you could" style discussion you can have with a customer, right? They may not do exactly like this, but a lot of customers still have a lot of old style processes with forms and people inputting them. But what if you could completely revolutionize the way it works with the Power Platform and do it? I mean, very, very quickly. You could model out that type of use case, even if you don't take it to production like that. You could model it out so quickly.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and that's where really the no pun intended, the power of the platform really shines here, right? Where we're able to basically take these building blocks and put something unique together that drives a lot of value. So just in summary, the Power Platform has a great extensibility story with Power Virtual Agents. We've seen it here with Power Automate. We saw how we can also connect in to AI Builder using a connector, and same thing with Q&A Maker. And then when we think about Power Automate Desktop, that unlocks a whole other number of systems that may not have APIs that we can also tap into as well in order to go ahead and to automate them. Now, naturally, what we do suggest is definitely start with some of those SaaS-based automation scenarios where, hey, instead of just providing the question and answer type style of chatbot, how can you go ahead and transact on behalf of that user and derive even more value itself? And then also, once you're in the mode of building those cloud flows inside of Power Automate, do take a look at those tips and find best how to go ahead and architect those solutions. Really think about not wanting to block your users, making sure that they've got good and user-friendly error messages that are coming back. And if you can shave off seconds from an execution, that will be worth it for an end user that's going to be waiting on the other end of the wire for that response to come back. And then, yeah, lastly, have some fun. Go ahead and explore. I think that's the beauty of the platform as well, is that you can go ahead and try these things out, see if it sticks, and really go ahead and experiment with this without making huge investments in order to find out if you've got some value to be derived here. It's an opportunity to go ahead, test and learn, and then be able to iterate quickly.
That's our next slide. Fantastic. Thanks, Ken. This was session 3, going through all the Power Platform and how it can help you build a fantastic Power Virtual Agent. I hope you enjoyed the session. Please join us for the next session in this series, where we'll be digging into Bot Framework a bit more and Azure and how they work with Power Virtual Agents. We'll see you then. Thank you very much.
And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Oh, yes, do that as well.